let's talk about homeostasis and what this term means and what's happening in our body. So the term homeostasis is the ability to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. So this means that we are maintaining a relatively constant body temperature. We are maintaining a relatively constant blood pressure. We are maintaining a relatively constant carbon dioxide level in our blood. So homeostasis is just the ability to maintain that internal environment, right? Now, one thing I want to point out though is that our internal environment, we say that no matter which of those conditions we're looking at, it is always in more of a dynamic state of equilibrium. And the term dynamic just means fluctuating. So let me give you a quick example. Okay, so dynamic means fluctuating. All right, so I'm going to draw, let's say we're going to do body temperature. Let's do 98.6. Okay, so here is our line, 98.6, and that is what we want our body temperature to be, right? That is a typical healthy body temperature. Is our body temperature always exactly 98.6? No. There are times when our body temperature is usually fluctuating around 98.6, right? But it's not always exactly 98.6. And this is what we mean when we say a dynamic state of equilibrium. And our body has ways to maintain homeostasis. So your body has a way to maintain a temperature of 98.6. So for example, when your body temperature starts to go up, right? If it starts to get a little high, what are you going to do to cool it back off? You're going to sweat, right? So you're going to sweat and you're going to cool it back off and you're going to get it back to 98.6. Well, what are you going to do when your body temperature drops below 98.6 and you're starting to get cold? Well, you're going to shiver. And it really doesn't want to make that little E right there. There we go. And it's going to bring your body temperature back up, right? So this is how our body can maintain homeostasis, right? You're not always 98.6. You kind of fluctuate around 98.6, okay? So there's actually 3 different components that help you regulate homeostasis, right? We're going to go back to that body temperature example. So the very first one I have up here is something called a receptor. A receptor is what's going to constantly monitor the changes in the environment and send that information to your control center. Okay, so let's use the body temperature example. So in this case, you're going to have temperature receptors all over internally in your body that are constantly monitoring your body's temperature. And what's going to happen is if your body temperature starts to drop, then they're going to send signals to the brain, which is your control center. Now your brain, your control center, is going to say, okay, wait a minute, now our body temperature should be at 98.6, but these receptors are telling me that our body temperature is really only like 98.5. So we're a little low. So your control center is determining what's the set point that the variable should be maintained at. And if temperature is a little too low, then your brain is going to send information to an effector. An effector is going to carry out the response. So in this example, if your temperature is too low, remember, what do? You shiver, right? So your brain is going to tell all your skeletal muscles to start contracting, because remember, when a muscle contracts, it generates body heat. So it's going to carry out that response to get you back to your set point. And so when we talk about maintaining homeostasis, we always talk about these 3 things that are helping to maintain and control it. A receptor picking up whatever the variable is, and in this example, the variable is temperature, right? But again, your variable could be something like CO2 levels, or it could be your blood pressure. But the receptor is going to pick up whatever the variable is, we'll say temperature. Your control center is your brain, and your brain knows what the set point should be. And if it's off from that set point, then your brain is going to elicit some type of change through an effector. Okay. Now, off to the side on the screen, I also have these terms here, afferent and efferent. Anytime you are sending information toward the brain, we say that that information is following an afferent pathway. I remember that because I remember the A in afferent for the A in approach. It is approaching the brain. Now, your brain is going to send information back through an effector so that you can maintain homeostasis, right? And in the example I gave you, it's going to be to shiver. So we say that's following an efferent pathway. I remember this one because it starts with an E, and I remember E for exit. Anytime information is leaving the brain or exiting the brain, we call that an efferent pathway. This is a great image from your book. This is just talking about homeostasis. So we can see here your book is going to use a lot of teeter-totter examples as it goes through homeostasis. So this is just going to say, okay, what we want is we want to be here. We want to be in balance. But if we get out of balance, right, if that teeter-totter is off, then that is the stimulus that is producing the change, right? And the detector is going to go, hey, this is different. We're not in balance anymore. It's going to send that information up to the brain, the control center, through the afferent pathway. Remember, it's approaching the brain. Then the brain's going to go, oh yeah, let's fix that. So it's going to send information to an effector. Okay, the example I gave you was your skeletal muscle through an efferent pathway exiting the brain. Now I want to mention you really can't talk about homeostasis without talking about feedback mechanisms. We have two kinds of feedback mechanisms. We have negative and positive. Negative feedback is the way that we maintain homeostasis. Okay, so the temperature example I gave you is negative feedback. A negative feedback mechanism, we say the term negative doesn't mean bad. That's what a lot of people think. They hear the word negative, they think bad. That's not what this means. Negative just means it's going to go in the opposite direction as the change. So it opposes the initial change. Okay, so let's go back to that temperature example I gave you, right, where we have a temperature of 98.6. Okay, and so remember, if our body temperature, we're trucking along here at 98.6, and let's say our temperature starts to go up. Okay, negative feedback, if we start to go up, negative feedback is going to oppose that change and bring it back down. Okay, let's say we're trucking along and our temperature drops. Okay, it goes down. Negative feedback is going to oppose that change and bring it back up. So the whole point of negative feedback truly is to maintain homeostasis. In fact, most homeostatic control mechanisms are negative feedback. This is how they operate and this is how they maintain that set point. The real goal of negative feedback is to prevent any kind of sudden severe change. Okay, you don't want anything to get way out of whack. You want it to stay at that set point. So again, I've already given you the temperature example. Another example I can give you is something called the antidiuretic hormone. And so if you think about this term diuretic, right, you may have heard of that before. A diuretic makes you urinate. Now I want you to think of the prefix anti. That is against or not. So an antidiuretic makes you not urinate. So this is going to be a hormone that gets released anytime you're dehydrated. So let's say you haven't had enough to drink today. Okay, if you haven't had enough to drink today, then let's do our line example again. Okay, so we'll say this is our water balance this time. Actually, here we go. Let's do it in blue. Okay. All right, so here is our water balance. Okay, here's our balance. This is where we need to be. And let's say we're trucking along and we haven't had enough to drink today and we start to get dehydrated. We start to go down, right? The last thing we want to do is urinate, because when you urinate, you're going to release more water. You're going to get rid of more water. You're going to keep going down. So your body releases this antidiuretic hormone, which makes you not urinate. And by doing that, it's helping to maintain your water balance. You're going to save it. Okay? Now, again, on the opposite end of that spectrum, let's say you're drinking a ton of water. Well, your water balance is probably going up. If you're drinking a ton of water, well, then you're going to be urinating quite frequently, right? It's going to be nice and clear. You're going to be going to the bathroom a lot, and that's going to help it bring it back down. Okay, so just like not having enough to drink is bad, it dehydrates you, having too much water is also bad, right? Because you can only get rid of so much. So that is negative feedback. It's helping you maintain this sort of homeostasis. It's helping you maintain that stable control center. So this is, again, the teeter-totter examples, and this one is combining getting too hot and getting too cold, right? So ideally where you want to be is right here in balance. If you get too hot, receptors pick it up. Your brain says, woo, we are too hot. Let's send that information out to our sweat glands and cool us back off and get us back in balance. Remember, on the way up to the brain, it's the afferent pathway. As it's exiting the brain, it's the efferent pathway. At the bottom, this is showing you what happens when it's too cold. So in this case, you're cold. Receptors pick it up, send it through an afferent or approaching the brain pathway. The brain goes, woo, we are too cold. We need to shiver and warm up. So it sends that information through the efferent pathway. It exits the brain and goes to your skeletal muscles, and it gets you back in balance. So both of these are negative feedback. Doesn't matter if we're talking about being too hot or being too cold. The job is to get you back in balance. Okay? Now the last thing I want to mention is the other type of feedback mechanism we have, which is positive feedback. Now again, a lot of people make the mistake. They think negative, bad, positive, good. That is not what this means. Okay? Remember, negative meant opposing the change. Positive means same direction as the change. So most positive feedback mechanisms are actually not related to maintaining homeostasis. Let me just give you a quick example, right? If this is homeostasis, if this is where we want to be, okay? Normally when we talk about negative feedback, negative means opposing the change. If you go up, let's say it's temperature again, let's say we should be at 98.6. Negative feedback means if your temperature goes up, you're going to oppose the change and come back down, right? And you're going to maintain 98.6. Positive feedback, remember, it means going in the same direction. So in positive feedback, if your temperature goes up, positive feedback means it's going to make it go up more and more. You're not getting back down to 98.6. You're going to keep going up. So this is not really related to maintaining homeostasis. Okay, that's not what positive feedback is for. Positive feedback actually causes a greater deviation from the set point. It actually creates events that are cascading events. It means they're self-perpetuating. So here are some really good examples. I'm going to show you the first one is blood clotting. So when somebody gets a tear in a blood vessel, okay, so this is where we're going to start. We've broken a blood vessel, you're bleeding out from that blood vessel. Positive feedback cycle is going to be initiated. And with positive feedback, what we're trying to do is we're trying to seal over this wound in the blood vessel. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use platelets that are found in our bloodstream. So typically what happens is you tear a blood vessel, blood starts leaking out. Now remember, blood has red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets in it. So as your blood starts to leak out, you get these sticky platelets that will start to stick to the edge of that torn blood vessel. Okay, these are the little purple things. Those are our platelets. Now platelets release chemicals. That's the little yellow balls here. Those are the chemicals that the platelets are releasing. And those platelets that stick start releasing chemicals that say, hey, there is a tear in this vessel. We need more platelets. So those chemicals call for more platelets, right? So you get more platelets come into the area, and more platelets mean more chemicals. You see where we're going? So the more chemicals, the more platelets. You get more chemicals, you get more platelets, until eventually you can see those platelets have completely blocked that tear in the vessel, and you form what's called a platelet plug. That's positive feedback. It is a cascading event, and it results in greater deviation from the set point. You started with no platelets and you got more and more and more and more until there's an end, until the vessel has been repaired. Okay? Another example that I can give you is labor contractions. When a woman goes into labor, a lot of times what is going to happen is right before a woman goes into labor, the baby is going to drop. And usually the babies sit up really high, and so you feel like you can't breathe. That last trimester, you can't have more than like 5 bites of food, and then you're full because there's no more room in there for anything. And then usually like that last week, you just feel great because the baby has dropped. And what that means is the baby has dropped down into position. The head is actually pushing on the cervix of the female, of the woman. And so what's happening as the head pushes on the cervix is the cervix is going to send a signal to the brain that says, hey, it's go time. And the brain releases a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin is what's going to cause the uterus to start to squeeze. So the uterus will start to squeeze, and the uterus squeezing is going to push the baby down more. Well, the cervix is getting more pressure on it, it's being pushed on, it's being thinned out. We call that effacing. And it's going to send a signal to the brain that says, we need more oxytocin. You release more oxytocin. So the uterus contracts more, and the baby gets pushed down more, and the cervix gets stretched more. And it sends a signal to the brain that says, we need more oxytocin. And you get more oxytocin, more uterine contractions, baby gets pushed down more. So we're going in the same direction. So this is why when a woman goes into labor, a lot of times the contractions start out pretty weak and pretty far apart. But eventually, right before, we call it the expulsion stage, right before the baby is born, the contractions are very close together. You pretty much have time to take a couple of breaths before you push again. They're very close together, and they're very strong. That's because of all that oxytocin that has built up in the body. Okay, so these are examples of positive feedback. You're going to go and go and go and go and go until there is an ending. So with labor, it's going to be obviously delivering the baby. Okay. When we talk about blood clotting, the end is going to be when you've sealed that vessel. So positive and negative feedback are very different from each other. Okay. The last thing I'm going to mention to you is something called homeostatic imbalance, right? So we know that homeostasis is trying to maintain this relatively stable internal environment. Homeostatic imbalance is a disturbance of homeostasis. It means that you can't maintain that internal environment. And there's a couple reasons why. One of them is age. As you get older, your body's ability to maintain homeostasis declines, which means that your internal environment becomes less stable. And if the internal environment is less stable, then you have a greater chance of getting a disease. You can't fight it off as well. So age is one way that we can experience a homeostatic imbalance. Another type of homeostatic imbalance, or the last one that I'll mention here, is sometimes when your body is going through negative feedback, a destructive positive feedback mechanism can take over, and it can be deadly. So an example of this might be, let's say that you have a normal rhythm to your heart. Let's say your resting heart rate is 70 beats per minute. And your heart rate goes up. It's high. Okay? We need to get it back down. And so negative feedback is going to oppose oppose the high, bring it back down, get it back where it needs to be. And so negative feedback will bring your heart rate back down, but then a destructive positive feedback takes over. And that's going to cause your heart rate to keep going down, 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 down until it stops. And so that would be, for example, like a heart attack, cardiac arrest. So that's another example of a homeostatic imbalance. You're trying to maintain homeostasis, but you can't. There's an imbalance there. Okay? You can't either because you've gotten older and you're less efficient, or destructive positive feedback mechanisms have taken over. So that's a little bit about homeostasis, how we maintain homeostasis through negative feedback, but also what positive feedback mechanisms do. Okay, they're important in our body for different physiological functions. But again, remember, positive feedback does not maintain homeostasis. That's what negative feedback does.